In 1914, 28 men set sail for the bottom of the world. They were attempting one of the last great prizes of exploration, the crossing of the Antarctic continent. But before they could even touch land, their ship was seized by an environment so hostile it seemed to be actively hunting them. What followed was a 20-month ordeal of crushing isolation, starvation, and a desperate voyage across the deadliest ocean on Earth. They would be forced to watch their home be destroyed by the ice, camp on dissolving floes, and make decisions that no human being should ever have to make. It was 1914, and the so-called heroic age of exploration was drawing to a close. The South Pole had already been reached by Roald Amundsen in 1911, and Robert Falcon Scott had died trying to reach it just months later. For explorers like Ernest Shackleton, there was one prize left: the complete crossing of the Antarctic continent, from the Weddell Sea on one side, across the South Pole, to the Ross Sea on the other. Nearly 1,800 miles on foot, through the coldest, windiest, and most isolated landmass on the planet. If you know anything about Antarctic geography, you'll understand that even reaching the starting point requires sailing through some of the most treacherous waters ever charted. The Weddell Sea, in particular, is infamous among sailors. It is a body of water so consistently choked with sea ice that ships have been known to enter it and simply never come back out. Shackleton named his ship the Endurance, after his family motto, "By endurance we conquer." He had no way of knowing just how much that name would come to mean. Now, if you know anything about Ernest Shackleton, you'll know he was not a man who did things quietly. He was Irish-born, broad-shouldered, and possessed of a kind of relentless optimism that bordered on the irrational. He had already been to Antarctica twice before. On his second expedition in 1908, he had come within 97 miles of the South Pole before turning back, a decision that almost certainly saved his men's lives. When asked why he didn't push on, he reportedly told his wife, "I thought you'd rather have a live donkey than a dead lion." That quality, the willingness to retreat when retreat meant survival, would define everything that was about to happen. To crew his ship, Shackleton reportedly placed an advertisement in a London newspaper that read, in part, "Men wanted for hazardous journey, low wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return, doubtful." Whether or not the advertisement is entirely real, the men who answered the call were extraordinary. Scientists, sailors, a carpenter, a photographer, a surgeon, and a stowaway they discovered only after leaving port. 28 men in total, sailing south aboard the Endurance in December 1914. Tragically, within weeks of entering the Weddell Sea, Shackleton would begin to understand exactly what he had led them into. The Endurance entered the Weddell Sea in early January 1915, and almost immediately, the ice began closing around her. If you know anything about pack ice, you'll understand that it doesn't behave like a solid wall you can simply turn away from. It moves, it shifts, it surrounds a ship gradually, almost imperceptibly, like a hand tightening around a throat. Shackleton's experienced ice pilot, Frank Worsley, recognized the danger early, but the pack ice moved faster than anyone anticipated. On January 19th, 1915, the Endurance was frozen solid. She was still 85 miles from the Antarctic coast, close enough to see the destination, too far to reach it on foot. As you might imagine, the initial mood aboard the ship was not panic. Shackleton had been in tight situations before, and the men believed the ice would eventually break and release them. They settled in to wait. They exercised on the ice, played football, trained their sled dogs. The ship's photographer, Frank Hurley, documented everything with a camera. For months, the Endurance drifted helplessly with the pack ice, carrying the men in the wrong direction, away from their goal. Winter descended. The sun disappeared entirely, and the pressure of millions of tons of shifting ice began, slowly and relentlessly, to work on the hull of the ship. By October 1915, the Endurance had been locked in the ice for 9 months, and the ice had begun to make its intentions clear. The pressure ridges surrounding the ship were building and collapsing in cycles, each time forcing millions of tons of frozen sea against the wooden hull. The sounds the men described were extraordinary, a constant groaning and shrieking of timber that made sleep nearly impossible. Frank Hurley wrote in his diary that it sounded like the cries of a living thing. The carpenter Harry McNish worked around the clock below deck, hammering braces against the hull, trying desperately to hold her together. But in any case, wood is no match for an entire frozen ocean deciding to move. On October 24th, the pressure became catastrophic. The hull buckled. Water began pouring in faster than the pumps could handle. Shackleton gave the order to abandon ship. The men hauled everything they could onto the ice: 3 small lifeboats, food, equipment, the sled dogs. They set up camp on the frozen sea and watched their home being slowly destroyed around them. On November 21st, 1915, the Endurance slipped beneath the ice and disappeared forever. The men were now standing on a floating ice floe in the middle of the Weddell Sea, 346 miles from the nearest land, with no functioning radio and no way to signal the outside world. It's unclear if any of them fully understood in that moment just how completely alone they truly were. What followed was one of the most psychologically demanding periods of the entire ordeal. The men were now living in tents on a floating platform of sea ice, in temperatures that regularly dropped to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, with nothing but the horizon in every direction. Shackleton established a camp near the wreck site, which the men called Ocean Camp. They salvaged what they could from the debris still visible above the ice: extra food, timber, equipment. But the situation required a decision that no leader wants to make. The sled dogs, which had been companions to the men for over a year, could no longer be fed. One by one, they were shot. The men who had trained them and lived alongside them described it as one of the hardest moments of the entire expedition. As you might imagine, morale began to fracture. Some men struggled with the reality that no rescue was coming, that no one on Earth even knew exactly where they were. Shackleton understood that despair was as dangerous as the cold. He rotated tent assignments so that pessimistic men were always paired with optimistic ones. He made sure everyone ate the same food, including himself. He monitored his crew constantly for signs of psychological collapse. For months, the men drifted on the ice, waiting for it to break up enough to launch the lifeboats. By April 1916, after 5 months on the floes, the ice finally began to splinter beneath their feet. The time had come to move. But where they were going next would prove to be even more terrifying than anything they had already faced. On April 9th, 1916, Shackleton ordered the 3 lifeboats into the water. They were named the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills. The largest, the James Caird, was just 22 feet long. To put that in perspective, that is roughly the length of a large living room. These were the vessels that 28 men were now trusting with their lives in the Southern Ocean, one of the most violent bodies of water on the planet. If you know anything about the seas surrounding Antarctica, you'll understand that the term stormy does not begin to cover it. Waves in the Southern Ocean regularly reach 50 feet in height. The water temperature hovers just above freezing, meaning that any man who went overboard would be dead within minutes. The boats were open to the elements, constantly taking on freezing water, and the men had to bail continuously just to stay afloat. They were soaked through every hour of every day. Their clothes never dried. Ice formed on the rigging, on the oars, on their hands and faces. One man, Blackborough, had feet so severely frostbitten that his toes would later have to be amputated. For 7 days they battled through heaving seas and freezing spray, seasick, exhausted, and barely sleeping. On April 15, 1916, they spotted land for the first time in nearly 500 days. A small, desolate, wind-battered island called Elephant Island. The men wept when they stepped ashore. It was the first time any of them had stood on solid ground in nearly 16 months. Tragically, they all knew it was not over. Elephant Island was completely uninhabited and lay far outside any shipping lane. No rescue ship would ever accidentally pass by. If they were going to survive, someone was going to have to go and find help. Shackleton made the decision himself. He would take 5 men and sail the James Caird, the largest of the 3 lifeboats, to find help. The nearest inhabited outpost was a whaling station on the island of South Georgia. The distance between Elephant Island and South Georgia is approximately 800 miles. To understand what that means in practice, consider this. They would be crossing the Drake Passage, a stretch of ocean widely regarded by sailors as the most dangerous water on Earth. It is the place where the Atlantic, Pacific, and Southern Oceans all collide, with no landmass to interrupt the wind for thousands of miles in any direction. Waves of 60 feet are not unusual. Hurricane-force winds are common. And they were going to attempt this crossing in a 22-foot wooden lifeboat, with no radio, no modern navigation equipment, and only the stars to guide them, when the stars were even visible through the constant storm clouds. Shackleton chose his 5 men carefully. Among them was Frank Worsley, the ship's navigator, whose skill with a sextant would prove to be the difference between life and death. On April 24, 1916, Shackleton shook hands with the 22 men remaining on Elephant Island, told them he would be back, and pushed off into the Southern Ocean. The men on the beach watched the James Caird disappear into the waves. Several of them later admitted they did not believe they would ever see Shackleton again. As you might imagine, the crossing that followed was unlike anything any of them had ever experienced or could have prepared for. For 16 days, the James Caird was thrown around the Drake Passage like a piece of driftwood. The 6 men took turns at the oars and the rudder in 4-hour shifts, the off-duty men crawling into a small, covered section of the bow, where they lay in several inches of freezing seawater, unable to truly sleep, unable to get warm, unable to eat a proper meal. The boat was so heavily iced over at times that the men had to crawl along the outside of the hull with ice axes, chipping away the buildup before the weight capsized them. On one night, Shackleton was at the helm when he spotted what he described as a line of clear sky on the horizon behind them. He called out to the men that the weather was finally breaking. Seconds later, he realized it was not clear sky. It was a wave. A single wave so large, he had mistaken it for the horizon. It hit the James Caird and nearly rolled her completely. The men bailed frantically in the darkness, certain they were about to die. Somehow, the boat righted herself. Somehow, they stayed afloat. On May 10, 1916, after 16 days at sea, Frank Worsley's extraordinary navigation brought them to within sight of South Georgia Island. They had missed a target of roughly 20 miles wide after an 800-mile crossing through the worst ocean on Earth. But when they landed, they discovered something that turned their relief into dread. The boat had been so badly damaged by the crossing that it could not be sailed again. And they had landed on the uninhabited western side of the island. The whaling station was on the eastern side. Between them lay the interior of South Georgia, a range of glaciers and mountains that had never once been crossed by any human being. On May 19, 1916, Shackleton, Worsley, and a third man named Tom Crean set out to cross South Georgia on foot. They left the other 3 men behind with the damaged boat, too weak to attempt the crossing. They carried a rope, a carpenter's adze they used as an ice axe, and a Primus stove. That was essentially everything. The mountains of South Georgia rise to nearly 10,000 feet and are covered in glaciers, crevasse fields, and near vertical ice slopes. No map of the interior existed because no human being had ever gone there. They were navigating completely blind, in the dark for portions of the journey, making life or death route decisions based on nothing but instinct and the faint light of the moon reflecting off the snow. At one point they climbed to the top of a ridge after hours of exhausting effort, only to find a sheer cliff dropping away on the other side, with no way down. They had to turn back and find another route, costing them precious hours. At another point, descending a slope in near zero visibility, with night closing in rapidly around them, they made a decision that under any other circumstances would seem absolutely insane. They coiled the rope beneath them, sat down on top of it, held onto each other, and slid down a 1,500-foot glacier slope in complete darkness, having no idea what was at the bottom. Worsley later wrote that he laughed the entire way down. They landed in a snowbank, uninjured, and kept moving. After 36 hours of continuous hiking, without a single moment of sleep, on May 20th, 1916, they heard something that stopped them completely in their tracks. It was the distant sound of a steam whistle from the Stromness whaling station, signaling the start of the workday. They had made it. When Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean walked into the Stromness whaling station on May 20th, 1916, the station manager, Thoralf Sorel, came out to meet them. He had known Shackleton personally from previous expeditions. According to the account recorded afterward, Sorel looked at the three figures standing before him, filthy, blackened with blubber smoke, hair matted, faces hollow with exhaustion, and did not recognize any of them. He asked who they were. Shackleton stepped forward and said quietly, "My name is Shackleton." Sorel turned away and wept. The three men were taken inside, fed, and given hot baths. Worsley later said it was the single greatest moment of his life. But Shackleton allowed himself almost no time to recover. 22 men were still stranded on Elephant Island, and winter was closing in fast. Every day that passed made the sea ice thicker and rescue more difficult. He launched his first rescue attempt just 3 days after arriving at South Georgia. It failed. The ice was too dense to penetrate. He tried again with a different ship. It was turned back by pack ice within miles of Elephant Island. He tried a third time, turned back again. For 4 agonizing months, the 22 men on Elephant Island waited, surviving on whatever they could hunt, living under the 2 remaining upturned lifeboats, which they had converted into a makeshift shelter. They had no way of knowing whether Shackleton was alive, whether anyone was coming, or whether they had simply been forgotten at the bottom of the world. Then, on August 30th, 1916, one of the men spotted a ship on the horizon. Shackleton stood at the bow, counting the figures emerging onto the beach. He counted once, then again. Then he turned to Worsley and said simply, "They are all there." All 22 men were alive. After nearly 2 years trapped at the bottom of the world, not a single member of the expedition had been lost. Ernest Shackleton never fully recovered from the physical toll of what he had endured. He died of a heart attack on January 5th, 1922, anchored off South Georgia Island, the same island he had crossed on foot to save his men. He was 47 years old and was buried there at his wife's request. In 2022, 107 years after she sank, the wreck of the Endurance was finally discovered on the floor of the Weddell Sea, her name still clearly visible on the stern. 28 men, 20 months, not a single life lost. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching The Mystery Loop. Hopefully, I will see you in the next one.